Hi, and welcome to the Research Room, a space to make research by the people for the people.
Perfect synergy.
And welcome back to another episode of Falsifiable Fridays. We are going to start a brand new topic for this month, and I'm going to be focusing on empathy. Empathy, I think that's a term that a lot of people know already. Whether you know it as empathy, maybe you know it as empathizing, maybe you know it as being an empath, whatever. All of that, I'll discuss a little bit of all that here. So I'll start today, and I'll kind of just like get into it because we already know what empathy is generally, to be able to feel somebody else's emotions, maybe take their perspective, potentially also to like be compassionate for someone else, which like honestly, I'll also say there's so much in the research that people don't agree on when it comes to empathy. There needs to be a lot more research on this to like really define what it is and how it happens in everyday life. And that's why I picked the article that I picked for this week, is literally to talk about that and to talk about this idea of what actually is empathy in everyday life. What can you potentially expect when it comes to empathy? What can you expect for like how often it happens, when it's most likely to happen? And I mean, does it also like, how does it relate to you, right? Like these are actions, they have consequences. What are those consequences potentially? So what happened in this study was people got 7 surveys a day, and these were very quick surveys, of course, but just kind of throughout the day. They had 7 surveys for 7 days. So a total of 49 different surveys throughout the week. And so in these surveys, they asked a whole bunch of questions, but some of the questions that I'll be focusing on today deal with if they had an opportunity to empathize or to receive empathy. And so all of that is really just, and they defined it like really, really loosely in this case of like, did you have the chance to feel somebody else's emotions? But they do also like allow it to be like, did you take somebody else's perspective? Were you able to like understand what they were thinking? Or did you have that like empathic sort of like compassion for somebody else? And so they asked all these questions, right? And they got some answers. And I'll talk about those answers. And as I've been doing, I will bring up some questions about like how believable are these findings? What are some other things that we should consider here? So I'll first say, like I've been talking about, there's these 3 different like potential ways that you could empathize. And yes, these are all very like distinct and they are different skills, but in reality, in everyday life, they happen to like co-occur. It's usually all 3 that's happening about 75% of the time that people are empathizing. It tended to be all 3. So not only are you feeling somebody else's emotions, you're also thinking, potentially you're trying to think about what they're also thinking about. And you have at least some amount of compassion for them because you're also thinking about what they're thinking about. You're also feeling what they're feeling. It's very natural to like have that compassion as well. And then other findings here. So they also found that, I mean, I think usually when we think about empathy, we're thinking about like we're trying to console somebody, we're trying to support somebody in these like more negative kind of instances. But in everyday life, it's not quite like that. For the most part, people are really trying, are just like, I mean, emotions happen, right? And emotions are both positive and negative and anywhere in between, right? So for the most part, people were empathizing with positive emotions, and that's, I think that's kind of a nice thing, right? That like it's not always this thing that like potentially could bog you down or like is bogging the other person down, right? It's about these good things that are happening, and we tend to also feel the good things that are happening with these other people. Pretty nice, right? So that happened, and that's of course not to say that like negative emotions didn't occur and empathizing with negative emotions didn't occur, but it did happen much less often, about a third less of the time. Maybe I'll say it a different way. Positive empathy happened 3 times as much as negative empathy. So quite a bit more. Um, and then, I mean, there's a whole bunch of findings here. Kind of like always, those other findings, and I mean, everything more comprehensively can be found in the other content that I make. I just want to focus on a few things here. One of the last things that I'll touch on here is this idea that, like, why empathize, right? Like, does it have any benefit for us? Does it have benefit for other people? Like, why even do this, right? So I can't completely answer that question, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. But I will say that on average, empathy is positively related to well-being. So what does that mean? That means that these two things happen in tandem. People that are feeling well, they tend to empathize. People that empathize tend to feel well. Both of those are occurring. We don't know if one leads to the other just yet. The other thing, though, is that there's this distinction that in the moment when you're empathizing, those times people tend to also feel well. But if you're a person that just like on the whole is empathizing, you maybe consider that as like a characteristic trait of yours, they tend to report less well-being. And I can talk about that a little bit here as well. So we have kind of these like conflicting findings, and I think they actually make a lot of sense, but they seem conflicting just on its face, right? So let me get into my questions, and I'll discuss all this through those questions. So first question here that we should consider when seeing these findings. So does empathy lead to well-being? We cannot say that here. I would say probably, right? Probably empathy leads to something. And I think that something is probably well-being at least some of the time. And that, I mean, who wants to hear that, right? We just want to know, does it or does it not? And I don't think it's that simple, right? And even if it were that simple, there's nothing in this research study that could point us in that direction. We just know that these two things happen simultaneously. Someone who is empathizing is also having well-being. So I think other things that we need to consider here is there's so many times that you can empathize. It's hard to just say on the whole that empathy is something that leads to well-being. You can think about when you're empathizing these positive moments versus the negative moments. And maybe they both do lead to well-being. Let's say that they do actually, right? They might happen for very different reasons. And that's another big complication here that we have to think about. So if it's like positive empathy, maybe it's literally like you feel better because you're surrounded by positivity. And if you internalize that positivity, at least to some degree, then you're also going to feel good, right? Like that makes sense. Nothing in this research says that, but that does make sense, right? The other thing would be if you're feeling negative, feeling somebody else's negativity, and like purposefully trying to do that, right? That also could be a very good thing. But like, I mean, you're feeling worse in the moment, but if your friend or your family member or your partner, whoever you are empathizing with, if that person ends up feeling better, then that means the people around you are also feeling better. That means they are feeling supported, they're feeling accepted, they're feeling validated, things like that, right? They're feeling like they can stand on their own 2 feet, and they can also be like a good support system back in turn for you, right? So it's a way of like, it's building up your social network. You're building that connection, you're building that bond with them, but also they are going to be a better friend in reciprocation because of that. They can provide you with more as well. Like, I mean, I don't necessarily want to talk in those like kind of terms of like people are just like utility and like practical things, but like that happens too, right? So this whole idea that like if you're empathizing with these negative sort of emotions, you're helping things that are very indirectly going to like come back to you, and that's a very good thing. You might have better well-being because of that. So two very, very different like takes on this, right? Both leading to the same possible conclusion. Everything that I said here is completely made up though. They are very logical kind of like steps to lead to well-being, but it's not something that has been actually like tested in this kind of case. So where does that leave us? Yes, so we're allowed to like think through things, we're allowed to have reasoning and logic and all that, right? But also we should like keep in mind that like there's nothing that actually supports this just yet other than our own thoughts and potentially our own experiences as well. But even if we have those experiences, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right, and that doesn't mean that it's something that just happens, broadly speaking. um, we also might come to the wrong conclusions, right? We might always know that like these kinds of things happen. So like let's say empathy is always supportive. um, Great, right? Potentially that does lead to better well-being, but what if other things are happening that we're just not aware of? So yes, support is happening, but it's actually more about like this whole connection sort of thing. So if support doesn't actually lead to connection, then like it's not the support thing, it's actually this connection thing. And maybe some other things lead to connection, which then lead to the well-being, right? So there's other things that potentially could be happening here, that it's hard for us to really like understand in the moment, right? Like we're just living our lives, and that's why the science sort of things happens, right? To try to like untangle this whole mess of things that are occurring, so that we know what are the most important parts to be focusing on, or to try to like also like manifest in our own lives, right? Um, so all of this is to say, yes, probably empathy leads to well-being, but also the opposite, right? Well-being probably leads to empathy. People that are in a better place are more likely to empathize. That also totally makes sense, right? And if you're not in a good place, it's going to be so much harder to empathize. Why would you want to? You don't even have the resources for yourself. Why are you going to give your resources to other people and help those situations? And like that's super valid, right? So yeah, I mean, all of this could potentially happen, and all of this probably does happen, and that's what also makes this very difficult. And it's hard. That's why it's also hard to ever say like, yes, empathy leads to this, yes, well-being leads to this, right? um, all of them are probably happening to some degree, and it takes a lot of work to really figure out, oh, like it's really like this is the first thing that happens and this is the second thing that happens, and from there it's like a cycle. Cool. Okay, so I'll leave that alone, because I want to get to a related point here, which is the idea that there are going to be times where empathy is positive. There are going to be times where empathy is negative, right? So maybe you had the question, when is that actually the case? When can we expect that? And again, we don't know. We at least not from this research. Potentially people can have some very good like thoughts on this, if they are very like well read on these ideas, if they have a lot of experience in their own lives, right? People probably naturally come to some conclusions that are reasonably like some things that we can expect. So again, I just want to point out that we don't know the actual answer, not at least not from this research. So if you were to like start saying to somebody like, oh, like sometimes empathy is good, sometimes empathy is bad, and then like you start to give your own like examples, just know that like nothing here is actually saying that. So everything that I've talked about so far is just on average. On average, people that are empathizing tend to have more well-being. There's also the opposite though, right? People on average that have this characteristic of empathy tend to have less well-being. So let me first unpack that a little bit. In the moment when we are empathizing, that seems to be like, I mean, if you're thinking about potential reasons for that, why that could work, there's the whole idea that if you're giving social support to somebody, then that is a very good thing, right? That's a very good thing, not only for that other person, that's good for you. That's good to like help you like realize like, hey, I'm this efficacious person, I'm a good person, I feel good knowing that I'm helping somebody, or at least attempting to help somebody. All of that, right, is and that seems like a very good thing. So in the moment as you're doing that, that could be happening. You could also be strengthening your bond with that person, your connection with that person. That also feels very good. That means that, like, I mean, you have that close relationship to rely on in times of need as well for yourself. Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, potentially just like the mere idea of like you feeling emotion, or you talking through something, or like to like let go of yourself for a little bit and like focus on somebody else. Like all those things could potentially just make you feel good in the moment. Um, there are also going to be consequences though after that, and depending on how you're doing this, right? Like it might be a very little consequence, or like a very like large consequence, right? If you're constantly doing this, and you're just kind of feeling worn out, and you're trying to do more empathy, you're trying to empathize more and more, even though you have already like kind of spent, then that's of course that's gonna be distressing, and that's actually another factor within empathy to always like kind of consider is, yes, you can empathize, but like also to what degree are you feeling personal distress? And so if you're feeling distress, probably empathy is not good, right? At least thinking like largely speaking, right? So if you are trying to empathize, and you end up just like you more stressed out than anyone else, like at the end of the day, like maybe it's nice that you help somebody, but also like now you have to live with that other emotion and like work through that. And so you can start to think and see why somebody who might have that trait of empathy, if they're also someone who is feeling personally distressed, then they're also more likely to have less well-being. If you can get rid of that component, great. But like that's bound to happen if you're constantly empathizing with people. Um, so when is empathy a good thing? When is it a bad thing? We don't know. We don't have nearly enough evidence and data to like really be able to answer that question. And again, that's not what this research, this particular research study that I'm referencing, that's not what they're even trying to say. There are going to be answers to this, and those answers are going to be very like unique as well to the person. But there are probably good like situations. There are probably like components of bad situations as well. So just keep that in mind. That with all this, it all kind of depends. And that's, I mean, that's unfortunately that's a lot of science. Is just this idea that it does depend, and especially when it comes to psychological science. There's just so many things that could potentially vary. That it's going to depend on the time, the place, what emotional state you're in, what emotional state other people are in around you, right? Like all these things could very much impact how this goes. I think the last thing I'll bring up for this point is just the idea of when is something good, when is something bad. Like that's such a hard thing to say in general, because like it depends on the actual outcome of interest. If you are thinking about like your own well-being, there can be times it's good or bad. If you're thinking about somebody else's well-being, then there are also gonna be times where it's gonna be good or bad. If you're thinking about like, oh, did I end up staying in this relationship? Like, hopefully that is your goal, whatever in whatever case that is. If that is one of your goals, did empathy help you get there? If someone said yes, then maybe that's a good thing. If someone said no, maybe that's not such a good thing. um, Potentially also somebody said yes, that's also not a good thing, right? So I mean, there's a lot of ways that that can happen, and it depends on what your outcome actually is. So yeah, keep that in mind as well. And then I think the last point here, that I'll briefly touch on is something that they found in this study was that people have on average 9 times that they might be able to empathize throughout the week, just on any given like normal week, right? Maybe there's going to be 9 potential occurrences that you could empathize. Cool, right? I mean, that's a fair amount, at least one per day. That you're actively trying to feel somebody else's feelings, or take their perspective, or like feeling compassionate. And I think all of that is generally good, right? That means that we're connected. That means that we want to belong, like all that. So not also bad. The only thing is that I wouldn't I wouldn't be tied too strongly to that number, because a few reasons, right? So if we think about the study design, and I mean, a lot of the things that come up are about study design here. Um, they measured people 7 times throughout the day and for 7 days. what does that mean? Like, that's not all the time, right? You could measure people much more often and see maybe if that number changes. Maybe you measure people 12 times a day. Maybe you measure them 15 times a day. Something else that happened in the study was that they only asked in the past 15 minutes, did you have a chance to empathize? Um, that's not everything, right? And even if they did have an opportunity, they could only have one that they report. So if, let's say, maybe it's like a weird day, right? Um, or maybe this is actually a normal day, but like if they couldn't capture it, that you are constantly having like 5 times within an hour that you're having to empathize. Maybe that's like a workplace kind of thing, right? Like that's going to depend on like where you work. Maybe it's something about your family situation and like in this moment, right? And yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, we've been around people more often, potentially, if you are living at home with other people there. Maybe that just brings up more times to empathize in the first place. So it's going to depend on the study design. It's going to depend on the context of things. They only did this for 7 days. What if you do this for a month? And maybe everyone at some point has like a week where it's like very heavily an empathy sort of week, but actually like throughout the whole month, maybe it's actually much lower. And maybe you can expect that like there's going to be like fluctuations in time. It's not like every single week it's 9. So yeah, I don't want you to be too strongly tied to that number, because I mean, first of all, this is like basically the first time that this has happened. I have a lot of other things to say. I'm going to say this in writing. I don't want to bring this up here because I want to make sure I get my thoughts out right. But I'll say that this is the first time that this has been done, basically, at least like using this kind of methodology. And so, yeah, I mean, that whole idea is like, I mean, so what if you saw this once? If you did this exact same study again, would you even get that? And I mean, who knows, right? We don't know. That's why research exists. That's why you're supposed to be doing these scientific studies. One last point that I'll say is that even if this number is right, let's say this number is 100% accurate, and it's not going to be 100% accurate for every single person. So even within this study, there's a whole range of empathic occurrences that could happen, or empathic opportunities that could happen. So even though 9 was the average in this study, it could have gone anywhere from like 6 to 12, let's say. And so even that is like, that's not the full range of things. For other people, there's going to be people that only had like maybe 1 opportunity. There's going to be people who had like maybe 20 opportunities. All of this it is like both in the research and not, right? Their conclusion is that 9 seems to be the average, but there's plenty of variety. And so we have to keep that in mind. And anytime you see a number, basically, there's always going to be some sort of like variation on that number, some sort of range or like spread or variation on that number. So yeah, I mean, these are, again, going to be all things that I continue to bring up. So if they are not yet making sense, that's okay. I'm going to continue talking about these kinds of constructs and continue to talk about all of the variations on this that potentially could come up. And all the other things that we still need to consider, right? There's so many other things that like I didn't even like try to touch on here that yeah, I mean, maybe you're even thinking about. So, I mean, if you ever do have those thoughts or questions, like feel free to leave them, talk about them. Like I'm glad to talk about these kinds of things. So for now, I'll end this here. I'll talk more about empathy throughout the rest of this month as well. And if you ever want to look at any of the other content that I'm making, that is on roomforresearch.com. And then also on social media is going to be at Room for Research. And so until next time, thank you. Thank you for coming. And yeah, talk again. Bye for now.